Thank you, and thank you for the pleasure of returning to the Ukraine. This is my first visit for 15 years, since the 10th anniversary of Chernobyl. I can see already from today this is a very different country from the one I visited 15 years ago. Let me say first of all what I am not going to say. Firstly, I'm not going to say that climate change is not an issue. I believe climate change is probably the biggest threat we face as a species. I'm not going to say that renewables have no role to play. The world started off with renewables. It amuses me slightly that we refer to wind and water as the new renewables. China was using wind power 3,000 years ago. Rome developed an empire based on water power, the power of horses, and the power of the muscles of slaves 2,000 years ago. I wonder when the trial period for renewables will end and they will be viewed as mainstream. I also am not going to say that we're living sustainably. Quite patently, as a species, we are so far from sustainability that it is frightening for anybody who cares to look at it. Nonetheless, what I would like to suggest to you is that green energy, or to be more precise, the way that a certain group of energies is being pushed as the solution to all problems by the green movement, is a very definite threat to sustainability and is something that not only Ukraine, but indeed the world, simply cannot afford to fall for. Sustainability must have three aspects. Of course, the environment is possible, but a policy cannot be sustainable unless it is also economically sustainable and socially sustainable. Any policy which focuses solely on the environment at the expense of economic and social factors will not be sustainable and will not deliver on the environmental goals that are set for it. And that, I believe, is the central danger that the stance which is pressed by the green movement and by people who make a very large amount of money out of the subsidies that go to renewables, the danger that that represents. Ukraine is indeed an interesting country. As I understand it, perhaps the three big issues in the energy field are firstly the enormous dependence on hydrocarbon imports, particularly from your, if I may say, not always reliable neighbour. Secondly, the heavy subsidies on energy prices, which do mean that you have a relatively energy inefficient economy. Your energy intensity is roughly double. By that I mean the amount of energy it takes per unit of economic activity is roughly double that of Germany, for example. And some real questions about your infrastructure and perhaps particularly the grid with very high power losses. What you don't have on the upside, as Stefan was saying, is a particular need to invest in large amounts of power capacity now. Now, I would suggest to you that new renewables really are not the solution to those problems. And at the heart of that is the fundamental intermittency, unreliability, especially of wind, when you can't tell when you're getting the energy, but also of many other renewables where they are more predictable. But since, as a world, we don't know how to store electricity, since we have to be making as much electricity as we need, no less and no more, if we are going to both keep the heaters going, and goodness me, I don't have to come from even England to Ukraine and start talking about how important it is that the heaters and lights don't go out in the middle of the winter. But also that we don't get too much power on the system, melting the wires and challenging security from that point of view. And in any country, I believe, that is looking seriously, and some countries claim to be, at, for example, with wind, the cost is not just in the cost of the wind generators. It's the fact that a large amount of backup capacity is needed, almost certainly gas-fired, which leaves you back in your problem with Mr. Putin's attitude towards the gas taps coming out of his country. But also a grid which is capable in a few hours on a very regular basis of switching from when the wind is blowing to perhaps a totally different part of the country where the backup capacity is available to provide it. Now, we don't have any grid in the world which is capable of doing that at the moment. All we know about it is that it will be enormously expensive because it will involve an awful lot more wire capacity, a lot of redundancy, if you're able to make sure your wires don't melt when the wind is blowing, but you can still get power when it's not, but also issues like that. Environmentally, the renewables are questionable. There's actually a report by Bentech in Colorado recently produced that suggests that because of the inefficiencies in their coal stations, by having to reduce output when the wind is blowing, they actually have higher emissions of acid gases, particulate, and greenhouse gases than if they'd never built any wind at all. And indeed, those of you who think that wind is an extremely expensive way of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, in Colorado you're wrong. Wind is an extremely expensive way of increasing greenhouse gas emissions. But most important is the social issue. In many countries, and mine is no exception, there is a growing skepticism about climate change, caused in part by the already high energy prices and growing energy prices to subsidize renewables. Offshore wind in my country receives a 200% subsidy on market price. Wave and tidal receive a 500% subsidy on market price. And yet, when a recent proposal was made to reduce that subsidy to 195% from 200%, one of the major wind generators said we were now going to rethink all of our future offshore wind. And I believe that if by piling pressure onto sources of energy that don't really add to security of supply, that don't anything like as effectively as is claimed reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but certainly do pile costs up, we're simply walking into the hands of those who don't wish to see climate change taken seriously at all. And my belief is that actually that's something that not only Ukraine cannot afford, that is something which the world as a whole cannot afford. Carbon capture and storage, and also nuclear energy, I would argue, are two technologies that must go forward and which, assuming that both do, I believe can answer these questions far more. If the Greens wish to start viewing those as green, then I'm quite happy to support green energy. But as green energy is understood at the moment, I would argue that not only Ukraine, but indeed the whole world, cannot afford to fall for the optimism of those who believe that green energy on its own can be anything but a minor part of the solution.